Sorry about the confusion with the time. Again, this allows me to participate in an ongoing course in Talmud. Can I have a copy?
Yeah, and just
I have. Yeah, thanks. Okay. An ongoing course in Talmud study. There are 18 of us members of the Rabbinical Assembly, conservative rabbis around the world, mostly in North America, but also one of my former students, Chaya Rowan Becker, who some of you met at Isaiah. She and Itai, her husband, came once and she gave a talk about what it is to be a female rabbi and Masorti rabbi in Israel. That was probably 5 years ago or so. So she's my chavruta, she's my study partner, and it was lovely to be with her. And the teacher of the class, Aryeh Cohen, many of you met when we did a series of Black Lives Matter from a Jewish perspective. Aryeh is the one with the big beard who talked about what it means allyship with the African American community over many years. He's at the AJU in LA that some of you know through your activities with the Chavurah. It's a course just for rabbis and relatively high level. It's just lovely to be back in that academic sphere where I'm not the one who has to come up with the things to say. I can just listen and make note of. And then later down the line, share it with you. We're studying the chapter in Baba Batra, which is the part of a larger section of the Talmud which was originally called Nizikin, which means torts. And this is property law, having to do with who has, if somebody claims ownership and if they've lived there for 3 years. And so it's really interesting. I think it has a lot of applications both for Israel-Palestine relations, Sheikh Jarrah, or as I mentioned last night, I forgot to say last night, and for those that were present in the presentation I made for Temple Har Shalom, is that it was 40 years ago exactly when Sasha and I moved from our moshav in the Gaza Strip down to the Yamit area, a place called Talmei Yosef, and we planted vegetables. We planted squash because it was a 6-week turnaround time, the fastest of all vegetables, in hothouse conditions, to kind of exercise or to show or illustrate our ownership over the land. We were against the pullback from Sinai. I won't speak for Sasha, but I will say that I was very happy to be proven wrong, that peace was attainable, and it's 40 years later, and we are still not at war with Egypt, even though it may not always be the greatest relation. We're not at war, and to me that's very promising. It also, of course, the study today in Talmud gave me thought to think a lot about where we're living and the fact that my landlord pays rent to the family in the local band of Agua Caliente, in the Kauai group of Indian tribes and clans. And while that may not be absolute justice, it's a form of restorative justice on ownership of land. So those are the kind of things that come up, and I hope to be able to share more with you as the time goes on. Coincidentally, or if we believe in God's finger, messing around with our, I don't know who that is, God's finger quietly or behind the scenes messing around with our lives. We're studying the issue of boundaries today, I should say borders, and a recurring theme in our study together over the last many years has been when we look at biblical text closely and we turn to lists, whether they're genealogical lists or whether they are lists of the booty that was taken in different places, the numbers, or whether it was last week the list of geographical locations going from place to place. There's a format, and the format is usually quite boring. And of course, it's interesting to look and see where the difference might be in the list itself. If something is outside of the format, this is something I say all the time. I know that you've heard it before. Then let's pay attention to that particular line, that particular paragraph. In this case, I'm not sure we're going to have that, but there's a much larger issue here, and we're only touching the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the sugya, the matter, the issue of borders of the ancient land of Israel, of the promised land. We talk about, oh, the promised land, and everybody talks about it as if they know what that, but when you throw it on a map, it's terribly, terribly complicated. And you are all, of course, filled with joy that I actually sent you a map. You got a map from me, which it doesn't happen very often in the last few years, right? A color map yet, Epis, a color map in the documents that I
Well, we
sent.
don't have the color.
Did you not get the?
Color, yeah, color.
You may not. I'm sorry. You may not have a color printer, so maybe you printed it in
Okay.
black and white. But if you look at it on screen, you'll see it's color. I am going to put up another map on screen today, which is not in color. It's brownish, grayish, whatever, because that's the way it's been printed in the book. I and I'll share that with you when we get towards the end. The text that I've chosen for today is not the entire chapter. It's it's half of it or so, but I wanted to be able to do the map stuff as well, and also, yeah, to keep it certainly to keep it in under an hour. Okay, any comments or questions before we go on? For those who don't remember where we were last week, we had followed the Israelites from place to place, not on a map itself so much, but from station to station. Vayisu v'yachanu, they traveled and they encamped. They traveled and they encamped. We talked about a little bit the certain places that the language expands and to show that something happened there that was noteworthy. And at the end of that section, God again commands the people of Israel, okay, I brought you to here. Now you're going to have to go in and conquer that land. And you've got to act properly in that land, because if you don't, then your lot is going to be the same as the ones that were there beforehand. Hinting at, or maybe even explicitly saying, that part of the reason that you're getting that land, and this is where we get into political issues, part of the reason you're getting that land is, although it was owned by somebody else and the land was worked by somebody else, or it was herded upon by somebody else, they did not worship me, the one God. They worshipped the foreign, the avodah zarah, the idolatry, and therefore they've lost their claim.
Inheritance.
They've lost their claim, not inheritance. They've lost their claim to the inheritance, right? In other words, they inherited, but they lost their claim, their legitimate claim, because they didn't recognize. I'm adding on a bit theologically. They didn't recognize that I'm the one who created this land. How dare you worship the Baal and other gods? Sorry, I can't resist. But an interesting thing, we have talked about the Baalim, especially when we were in the book of Judges. The Baalim, which is the same word, it's a synonym with Adon. Adon and Baal both mean owner, Lord, and Adonai means our gods. Literally, that's what it means, but it's Elohim, right? It's the plural. The same thing they use with Baal. The Baal was a local fertility slash rain, thunder, god of thunder. Many of you know in the Canaanite pantheon, but also the Torah or the biblical literature often refers to the Avodat HaBaalim, the worship of the Baalim, the multiple, even though there might have even been one. In the language of the Mishnah, the first level of the Talmud, and I'm sharing with you something I was looking at today in preparation, is that there are different classifications of types of real estate. And one of the kinds of real estate is called Ste Habal. Ste Habal is a field of Baal, and you might have thought, or Beit Habal, you may have thought that it belongs to the master, but no, it's a field that's only watered by the rain. I don't know if there's a term for that in English. It's not irrigated. There's no canals. You don't bring buckets of water. You only grow crops that will grow with the rain, which in Israel today, in modern day Israel, means what's called winter wheat, wheat that grows only from the rains in the winter, and that's a specific kind of agricultural category or real estate category, and that's interesting because it's called that because of the god of Baal, which I think is kind of cool, how it infiltrated the language, although when I was in Yeshivat Kerem B'Yavne, nobody ever told me that etymology. Okay, so that's where we are from a context point of view. We go on now to the actual the text. Why don't you read the first section for us, Richard, please? Does everybody have the text? Do I need to put it
Yeah,
in the chat box?
I just needed to unmute, that's all.
Okay.
So the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, instruct the Israelite people and say to them, when you enter the land of Canaan, this is the land that shall fall to you as your portion, the land of Canaan with its various boundaries.
Okay. Now, we look at that sentence. Is there anything interesting or noteworthy about that sentence in the way it's worded? Well, first of all, let's just reiterate that these are the boundaries, not that they've been conquered this way. These are the promised boundaries by God. So God has told Moses to command the people. This is a mitzvah, tzav, from the word, the same word is the same. Tzav is a commandment, or tzav is to command. Here it says instruct, but command might be even better, as in mitzvah, tzva, tzav, mitzvah, right? It's from the root tzva, tzadi vav hey,
That's
tzadi vav yud.
the
And
one. That one.
and so it's a God's commandment that these shall be the boundaries. So it's not the same as Abraham and the ancestors, where God said, "These will be your boundaries. This is what I promised you." This is a variation of, no, this is what I'm commanding you to go out and conquer. This is the promised land, and I'm commanding you to go out and take this land. So in this story, the way that it's written here, they haven't taken it yet, right? But this is the way that it purports to be. God is telling them. Okay, and then another interesting, from a word point of view, is the use of the word. This is the land that shall fall to you as your portion. It's not fall as in I fell upon somebody. It's related, but it's something has befallen him. You know, the way we use the word fall in that way, the word in Hebrew is tipol lechem menachala. Tipol is very specific. Falling, that is the lots. The lots were thrown in such a way that they fell. The way the dice fell. Can we say that right? The way the dice fell? That's what this would be like. These were what's going to go on now is that Moses is going to take like a tour around the borders of Israel according to the way it was appropriated by Lot that we read about. That we read about a few months ago, or whatever it was, towards the end. We did read about it. Yes, yeah, yeah. Because it's after that we have the story of the daughters of Tzlofchad, who say that it's not fair we didn't get an inheritance. Okay. All right, Richard, why don't you read another section for us, please?
Your southern sector shall extend from the wilderness of Zin alongside Edom. Your southern boundary shall start on the east from the tip of the Dead Sea. Your boundary shall then turn to pass south of the ascent of Arabim
Akrabin.
and continue to Zin, and its limits shall be south of Kadesh Benera, reaching Hazar Adar and continuing to Azam. From Azam, the boundary shall turn toward the Wadi of Egypt and terminate at the sea.
Okay. So we're going to take a look at the map in a second. I'm going to actually throw it up, throw it up on the screen. But just to look at some of the words, I mean, everybody recognizes at least one place here, right?
The Dead Sea.
Right? Dead Sea. Now, what is the Dead Sea called in Hebrew? Anybody?
Yam Hamavet.
No, that would be a direct translation. Yam Hamavet would be the Sea of the Dead. But what does it say here in the Hebrew text, Ella?
Oh,
It's at the end of the first, 2/3 through the first line of the Hebrew.
yeah, I see it. It's Yam HaMelech.
Right. So Yam HaMelech, what does that literally mean, Ella?
The Sea of Salt.
Right. So literally, or not literally, but very similar to the Salton Sea, right? Yam HaMelach. Um, but of course we understand why it got the name of Yam HaMavet, and I didn't look up to see exactly when that happened. Did it happen in Greek times? That would be an interesting. When does it start to be called the Sea of Death? Because nothing lived in it. Nothing lives in it to this very day. Unlike, say, the Salton Sea, which had a high salt content because of the way it was formed. But there were, at least at one time, not anymore, there were fish, tilapia, that were not planted, but that were whatever you do with fish when you uh,
Stocked.
stock. Thank you, stock. Yeah, you don't plant fish, right? You stock fish. I'm still in my farmer mode because of the study of agricultural pieces of property last hour. Okay, let's take a look at the map now, and let me see. The best way to do that is the best way to do that would be this.
Not 56.
Do you see the map on the screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. See how beautiful, Sid, do you see how colorful it is? I just want you to show that this is what you're missing by not having a color printer. Isn't that pretty?
Yes.
There you go. Okay. I just want Sid to recognize that it's pretty. Okay. So let's imagine this right over here. I mean, you could see, right? The coast, Haifa would be over here. Jerusalem is even mentioned here. The salt sea, here it says salt sea actually, as opposed to the Dead Sea. We can imagine Moses being right around here, right? It's kind of like, these are the plains of Moab, this area here, the steppes of Moab. And there's the mountain Nevo is around here someplace. And just not because the text here doesn't say that Moses is standing on Nevo, but I always imagine it that way because that's where God said at the end of Deuteronomy, you go up and look at the land. No, you're not going to go in, but you can look at it. But if somebody's on a high place over here, they look to their left, they see the first thing they start with when they're talking about the southern border is the Yam HaMelech. Does everybody see that? Okay. If you don't see something, say, I can't see everybody on the picture now, so I don't know if you can't see your faces, but because, and I want you to savor the fact that we're using a map today. You notice how I'm rubbing that in quite a bit with the map? Okay. I love the name of this place here that you had trouble with pronouncing it, Richard. This is the ascent of the Akrabim. What does that literally mean, Ella?
Scorpion.
The scorpion. It's the ascent of scorpions, and there is a place, to this. I don't know if it's in the exact same place as on this map, but there's a place here also that today is called Malei Akrabim. It's a very steep, zigzaggy kind of a road that goes up. I guess at the time it was either it was known for scorpions being plentiful there, or perhaps it was because it was shaped in such a way as a scorpion's tail. I don't know. And then it kind of goes across. So if we're looking at what's out here in Israel today, the Dead Sea Works are here. Arad is around here, right? Which is an ancient town that became a development town in the state of Israel in the 40s, 50s. And then it cuts across. So the state of Israel today goes all the way down to here, which is where Eilat is. But this is part of the wilderness. So we need to think all the time that when the wilderness wanderings, they kind of stayed below this line. Part of them were in the wilderness of Tzin, but maybe the bottom part. But they kind of went in this area here. But Beersheba would have been the southernmost, the largest southernmost settlement that's mentioned, and that's here. But the border itself, according to numbers here that we're reading, goes like this until it goes across to, continuing to Atzmon. And Atzmon is over here. Now, the river of Egypt is disputed where that is exactly, right? According to this understanding of mapology, I'm sure there's a word, it's cartography. Is that what mapology is? Cartography, I think?
Yeah.
Cartography. The river of Egypt, this is understanding that it's something called Wadi El Arish. And Yamit, that I mentioned beforehand, was very close to here. And it's a dry riverbed. Maybe it was wet at the time. But some people claim that the river of Egypt, some people claim river of Egypt was the Nile itself. But nobody really believed that was ever a land that was promised to the Israelites that would extend into the kingdom of Egypt. Doesn't make a lot of sense. And some people hold that this river here, which is called Nachal Psor, this is the river of Egypt. So all maps, this is one of the reasons I don't bring maps. They're really, really complicated. It's going to get even more complicated than this one here, which is relatively simple, which is why I chose this one from the dozens of maps that relate to our text today. And so just to give you an idea, if Nachal Psor is here, then that means for many that the biblical land of Israel, the border didn't go here so much, but it more went up in this direction here. Would have included Beersheba, but would have been cut off here. Never, ever really including Gaza Strip. And we'll talk a little bit about the issue of Gaza Strip then. Where Sasha and I lived was right here, where my cursor is, right just south, about a kilometer south of the city of Gaza, in a place called Netzarim. And down here, the last settlement that was established in protest of the peace treaty, and it was a very short-lived settlement, and then it was replanted someplace after the pullback from Sinai in 1982, someplace in what was called, in this area over here, was called, it was replanted in the Gaza Strip, was called Atzmona. And I was at Atzmona a number of times. It was very, very exciting, heady, a lot of young people. It was what we think of as a hitnachalut, as the old kind of settlement. A bunch of people going up on a mountain, building a tower, that kind of stuff. That's what it felt like, and that was in 1981-82. And so the names that were used for this, and that's the last thing that was mentioned here. Atzmon to the boundary shall turn toward Wadi of Egypt. So Atzmon, here it has probably Atzmon over here, but Atzmona was over here. All right, I've blended a lot of different things. I apologize, but I'm a little bit across the board right now in my thinking and my conscious. The red line here is a slightly different map, although you can see it's pretty similar, slightly different, and it's from Ezekiel 47, which is the second half of the book of Ezekiel, which is in the time to come. There are lots of prophecies that Ezekiel says to the people, shares with the people from God. This is what's going to happen when you go back from the exile. Things are going to go back to the way they should have been. And there's a number of stuff. And his map, which we're not doing Ezekiel now, but his map of the breakdown of the tribes is also different. It feels like it's more egalitarian. But I think the author of Ezekiel, whether it was Ezekiel or somebody else, wanted to say in the end of times it's going to go back to the way it should have been. And the way it should have been, not the way it turned out, but the way it should have been is in our chapter today. That's the bottom line of our chapter today, is the way it should have been. Comments or questions?
Yeah, I noticed that Ezekiel's is in the south, it's shorter. Now I can't see the north. In other words, it's smaller. The area in the south, it's larger in the north, a little bit larger in the north, but smaller in the south.
Yeah, so here's the challenge again with cartography and biblical cartography. This is why I've never really delved into this, because I find it rather frustrating. How do you throw a map? How do you throw text onto a graphic? Which is a fascinating topic. I have books. There was a time when in my first pub in the early 90s, or like 94, 95, I was fascinated because of the internet and trying to figure out how do we throw it into images and graphs. I have a number of books. They're in a box someplace, but a number of really interesting books on this topic that talk about kind of the Torah of graphs, of graphology, if there's such a word. And because I don't have a math or a science background, I'm still not used to using graphs and those kinds of things. But it's a real interesting theoretical idea. Well, the challenge when it comes to maps all over the world, and all the more so when we're talking about texts that were written 2,700 years ago, 2,800 years ago, but based on documents that could have been 30, as we're going to say today, 3,500 years ago. Well, how do you put them on the ground today? Where do you know where a place is? Well, it's easy when it's called Yam HaMelach, because there's only one of those there. Or when it says Yam HaGadol, I'm sorry, Yam HaMelach meaning the sea of salt. Or if it says the Yam HaGadol, the Great Sea, and that's what it calls the Mediterranean, even though we know differently, but that's what they, well, that's easy, right? Or the Jordan River, or even Tel Dan, because there's such a well-established Tel, that is a hill built on the earth built up over a city or a town. There are places that are easy to know. Tel Dan is one of those. Mount Hermon is one of those, although it could have been called Mount Har, Har HaHor. We don't know exactly what the biblical reference is to where it was. Beersheba, there was an unending settlement from biblical times in the same place, so that we can know. But other places, it's really hard. It all depends on the archaeology. So many biblical scholars, the early biblical scholars in the 19th century, when they got to Israel, so they heard the Bedouin or the Arabic names, but preserved by Bedouin all around the Holy Land. And if there was a beer something, a bear like a well of something, or a place called no, why can't I think of Galgal is Jajalia. What would be a good I can't. But if we have places that have an Arabic name, well, maybe that preserves the name for the last 3,000 years, which is, on one hand, far-fetched. On the other hand, maybe not, because there's been continual settlement in the same place. But you're always going to have these discrepancies in maps with different places because of the difference in names. And that could have already been between Ezekiel and Numbers, right? It could be that he had this one name meant something else to Ezekiel already, that would explain the relatively small discrepancies in these two maps here, the way they're drawn.
Yeah.
Comments or questions?
Yeah, but actually, at what point it's written in the Torah or someplace that the Jews were promised to go all the way into Iraq to Mesopotamia? Where does that come in?
So that's not in our topic. That actually, as I said, the serendipity of it all, the coincidence of it all, the God working behind the scenes, that was in the presentation last night about the land promised to the Euphrates, to the great river, and that would have been all the way out there in Iraq of today. So that's in the text that I brought last night from Genesis. This would be not one, but this would take us a year, literally a year every week, if we were to study the boundaries and the Torah of the borders that are in biblical literature, because it's not just what's in biblical literature itself. There are major lists here. This is one of the major lists, but there's lists in Joshua, there's lists in Judges, there's reflections of these lists in different parts of the other parts of the Hebrew Bible. And that's only...
There's a pail.
All right, we've
with
got some...
old leaves and stuff
Jackie, please mute
and
yourself.
water. If you could empty it out.
I can't...
You know what I'm saying? You know what I mean? That pail that's back here? Yeah, so my daughter says it's not good to have the water in the old.
Please, everybody, take that as a lesson. I don't always have the whole screen up so I can mute you. That's usually I do it myself, but it's kind of deceiving when you're looking at a screen. You don't think anybody can hear you. Okay, so those are maps all over the place. So one of the things we're going to talk about today, which does factor in what you asked, Ella, is what about the promise? What about the ideal? And what about what happened de jure? The avad is de facto, right? What's de jure? What's de facto? And there's just it's there's just all sorts of versions of that. So
To me, this kind of makes more sense than the other one is kind of all the way to Mesopotamia is kind of far-fetched.
right. So the question, so far-fetched would be, it would be hyperbolic for biblical literature to exaggerate, which is not unique to any literature, certainly not ancient literature. We have of hyperbole, hyperbole in ancient Near Eastern texts when it comes to all sorts of things, including borders. But the question, Ella, would be: does this even make sense? Does this really reflect reality? And we'll get to that in a second. We'll get to that almost right away. We just did now the eastern border, right? We started the southern border, which he started from here, because he started from here, even though this would still be the eastern border for us. But he started from the Dead Sea and went around this way. That's what he calls the eastern border. The southern border, excuse me. The southern border. Okay. Sue Spicer, why don't you read for us the next section? Remember, we just got to the sea. So I'm keeping the screen, I'm keeping the map on the screen as you read.
All right, 3 to 5.
Yes, please.
Your southern sector shall extend from the wilderness of Zin alongside Edom.
I read that.
No, I'm sorry. It's number 6. I apologize.
Okay. For the western boundary, you shall have the coast of the Great Sea that shall serve as your western boundary.
Okay. The reason there's an A there, by the way, those stay in from the when I cut and paste from the website. That's a comment in the New Jewish Publication Society, which only says that it's called the Great Sea means the Mediterranean. But that's what it says, Hayam Gadol. So this was easy, right, Sue? This is easy.
Yeah.
When you have the ocean as a border, that kind of makes it simple.
Right. Unless you're a good swimmer.
Right. And so that and in the world, or excuse me, Sue, unless you have ships. Which brings us, Harold, would you like to tell us, Harold, I know this is a hobby of yours, you love a real interest of yours. Harold, tell us what's problematic about what Moses just told the people of Israel. I'm springing this on you now, but it connects to a question you asked me in the email the other day.
Oh my God! What was the question? Oh, God.
Well, it had to do with Avimelech.
Avimelech, yes.
He was the Grar. Grar is down here in the biblical story of Abraham.
Yes.
What is in Ecclesiastes, Dan? All rivers lead to the sea, right? That's already in Ecclesiastes. All weekly study sessions always lead to the same place. We did this in Monday's lecture about the story of Abraham and Sarah going down, and then Isaac going down to Gerar. Gerar is in the area of Gaza, and his name was Avimelech. But you asked me an interesting question about that, Harold. Do you remember what you asked me?
Yeah. Well, the question has to do with the fact that here you have he was the king of the Philistines, a non-Semitic people, and here you have his name couldn't be more Hebrew. So I'm thinking, are you thinking about the sea as a western boundary? It is a boundary, but you're not taking into account the fact that there are peoples beyond the sea, referred to as the sea peoples, namely the Philistines and probably some other peoples, and most likely of Greek origin, coming in and settling in this area.
So that's one thing I'm thinking. I'm thinking of two things. That's one thing I'm thinking of, Harold. Exactly. And that's kind of that was what sparked that in my brain was when Sue said, unless you swim really well. And then I said, well, unless you have boats. Well, unless you're seafaring. If you're seafaring, then oceans don't mean as much as they used to, right? Just in the same way that, well, okay, with missiles, right, the borders don't mean what they used to. The minute we had mortars and missiles and projectiles and things like that. And so that's one issue here. The other issue is, so they came from the outside. The other issue is this was never conquered, right? We never really got through this. The thorn in the side of the Israelites throughout biblical historiography are the Philistines.
Right.
And that's where they lived, this whole area over here, right? Whether it was in the time of Joshua, whether it was the time of the judges, whether it was the time of David and kings afterwards, this was the Plishtim were there. And so the Israelites never really conquered this land. That's why some people tend to think that this is the river of Egypt, this area here. But even that land was still the 5 towns of the Philistines. Gaza was one of them. It was Ashdod, Gaza, Gat, and
Ekron.
Ekron. Thank you. Yeah, and so you can and those so by the way, those sites are more or less on those towns in modern day Israel are close to or on the same site where there was archaeological evidence where those cities were. Now you have a Jewish population there in the pre-modern period, late Middle Ages, pre-modern. There's a famous 17th century Rabbi, Nathan of Gaza. When we lived in the Gaza Strip, Nathan of Gaza was a student of Shabtai Tzvi, for those that follow the fascinating chapter in Jewish history of false messiahs, or fascinating category, I should say. And in the southern part of Gaza, do you remember, Sasha, the ruins of the synagogue? The Mosaic ruins? No, I don't know if you were aware. Maybe you didn't come. There was a roped off area of a mosaic floor that had been excavated after the 6-Day War, of course, and it wasn't well preserved. But I remember the synagogue there, and I was thinking, hey, it was within walking distance from our moshav, right? It was about a 45-minute walk in the days that we walked freely in that area, and it was kind of cool to see it. It wasn't that well preserved, but it was interesting to see a synagogue in the Gaza Strip, ancient synagogue. Okay, comment? Yes, Harold.
I just want to make a comment with regard to archaeology or history, is that archaeology, and I couldn't, I can't give you super details about this, but there have been archaeological digs in both Philistine sites and ancient Israelite sites that show that there, for example, like Philistine pottery being found at Israelite sites and back and forth and so forth, that suggests that, contrary to where the Bible is saying that these two people, Philistines and Israelites, were constantly at each other's throats, that there was actually some degree of trade, of interconnection, that that they were not necessarily constantly at war.
So let me draw an analogy for you to what you just said, Harold. I absolutely respect what you said, and of course I agree with what you said, but everything looks different from a distance, right? The European Union, right? If you were to somebody say, well, they're constantly at war with each other. Well, if we take a step back a few hundred years, yeah, pretty much there's a constant state of war in Europe, or Mexico and the United States in a shorter amount of time, and et cetera, right? It all depends. When you take a step back for hundreds, if not thousands of years, yeah, it's a pretty messy relationship. If you zoom in on any given decade, maybe even 70 years, who knows? Yeah, there was interchange. And you know how we know that? Not only from the archaeology, Harold, but this supports, say, the stories of Samson. Right? It's not that I'm saying Samson was a historical story, but the historical reality, the reality in which somebody could write about Samson having his interaction and marrying and Delilah and the other women that he dealt with, it posits a certain plausibility that there could be that kind of mixture going on at the same time. Right? Even if Samson is not a historical tale, but it made sense to the people telling the story, right? So these are fascinating topics. They really are, and it's not a direction that I really went in my own studies. As you know, my own studies focused on and narrative prose, and as you've guessed, and the history of interpretation from the Bible interpreting itself all the way to this very day. So, but this is great. So thank you for that, Harold. Anything else? Please share with us anything you know or questions.
Samson story regarding to this.
Sid, did you want to ask something?
I'm sorry. I forgot. I hadn't muted. No, I was thinking about the Samson story while you were talking about this.
Right, because Gaza, right? We spent so much time on that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. Any other questions or comments before we go on to the next section? So the western boundary is pretty easy because it's an ocean. Sue, why don't you read for us 7 to 9?
This shall be your northern boundary. Draw a line from the Great Sea to Mount Hor. From Mount Hor, draw a line to Labo Hamath, and at the boundary, and let the boundary reach Zerdad. The boundary shall then run to Zephon and terminate at the Hazar Enan. That shall be your northern boundary.
Okay. Just to give us an idea, if Haifa is here, you see what they did here? They went from green to yellow. And Tel Dan, that's called Etzba Galil, I don't know what they call it in English. Ella, what's Etzba Galil in English? Do you know, Sasha?
Yeah.
It's the part of the Galil that sticks up. But this is the border with Lebanon. So we are way, way up there. Like this is the biblical land of Canaan. We think of Canaan just going up to the border with Lebanon because of our association with the state of Israel. But this was the same culture. And the tension, by the way, what you said, Harold, about the Philistines, the same could be said about all the Canaanites. The mixture of Israelite, as of course you know, Israelite settlements that had little Baals and little idols all over the place, right? Even in there's a famous Baal that was found in Ir David, right, in the city of David, even. So this is way up there, right? And so if I think this is Ras Shamra, I'm pretty sure. No, because Ras Shamra would be higher than this. This is Syria, but Ras Shamra is the site in the southern coast of Syria where which was Ugarit, that I've mentioned very often, Ugarit, which we just happened to find a huge trove of documents there that we refer to, and it's very similar to biblical Hebrew. So you have the same language of Western Canaanite language. This is all called Western Semitic languages, as opposed to, including this area here, as opposed to over here in Mesopotamia, which was also Semitic languages after Sumeria, in the period after Sumeria, so Assyria and Babylonia, and the Western and the Eastern Semitic languages are similar, but not nearly as similar as the languages from here. So there's archaeology with artifacts that you dig up from the ground, and there's archaeology, quote, air quotes, archaeology in language itself. Okay. So, Sid, why don't you read 10 to 12 for us, please?
For your eastern boundary, you shall draw a line from Hazar Enan to Sephon. From Sephon, the boundary shall descend to Riblah on the east side of Ain. From there, the boundary shall continue downward and abut on the eastern slopes of the Sea of Kinneret. The boundary shall then descend along the Jordan and terminate at the Dead Sea. That shall be your land as defined by its boundaries on all sides.
Okay, so it's not exactly the directions the way we would do it. We would be a little bit more exact, perhaps, but we get the feeling here, and it's a large area. This is not like, if you were with us last night, the map of settlements and Palestinian enclaves in the West Bank today, which is this kind of impossible quilt work. This is pretty, it's a big piece of land. It reminds me of the states of the United States that are kind of exactly square or rectangular. That that it, so that maybe there was a river, but somehow they utilized whatever, and very often there is no river. But the kind of this blunt, well, let this be like this, as opposed to say, May, California or Maine or Vermont, or even Texas, that are, no, that's not a good. Those aren't good examples. Forget it. I forget I said that. What I think I want to say is that it feels like it's being oversimplified.
But it looks very much in an area what we have now, because whatever we lost in the north, we gained in the south.
Yeah, one might say that. That is, of course, and of course, what Ella is doing is she's jumping whatever we lost in the north. Well, first of all, assuming we ever had it, right? And that's really the next question: was this ever really realistic? How far is there? Can anybody prove that the Israelites ever actually lived up here? But what Ella said, whatever we had, we lost it, or we gained in the bottom here. We being in 1948 after the War of Independence. So, but yes, well, first of all, it's not Uganda. Let's place it that way, right? It's not another place in the world. And another really interesting thing here that nobody's commented on. Of course, maybe I didn't draw out that question, but from what we've known and what we learned about already in the book of Numbers in the last month or two, what is off with this command? This Moses is telling the people that this is the boundaries. Anybody? What's off with this? What doesn't make sense? Do you see my cursor here?
Yeah, we're missing the land for the 2.5 tribes on the eastern side.
Exactly. So
Manasseh, Ephraim, and Gad.
So there's all sorts of ways of solving that. One is to say, well, there's just different sources, and another one is to say, well, is to go along a little bit with the narrative. Remember what Moses said to them? You can't change the plan now. They said, no, but we'll fight with you. Don't worry, we'll fight with you. And so that won him over. Okay, they'll fight with it as if that was the problem. But another point he could have made, and I think what this text is making here, the way the editor placed this text after that is, it could be the 2.5 tribes are going to be on the other side, but that's not the way it should have been. The way it should have been was it should have never gone beyond. Let's just take this right now. Should have never gone beyond the Jordan River. Okay? And I think what I want to say is that in the Bible itself, in the Torah itself, there's a wide degree of flexibility, plasticity, whatever, of what exactly are the boundaries, right? So I think there's a lesson in, if I zip forward to 2022 of January, how are we at Ora Midbar making sense of this text, whether we're here in the desert on Indian land or whether we're in Mauritius, where I don't know the history but I know there must be some French history there because there's French and who conquered and who had that land, that island at what time where Corinne lives. We think in terms of who owns the land, how it happened. Is that there's a lesson here in humility, is that even our own records are very unclear about exactly what of the land is and what of the land is not part of the promised land.
I have a question.
Please.
Okay. The city or the town, whatever it's called, Riblah, R-I-B-L-A-H.
Yes.
Okay. My maiden name is Riblar, R-I-B-L-A-R. Now, this may be an absurd question, but how did we get our last names? Did we acquire it from where we lived? I've always been curious about that.
All right, so it's not a bizarre question. It's a really good question that I am absolutely, totally, Richard, I know this is going to break your heart to hear me say this, but I'm absolutely and totally unqualified to answer. But what I will say is that there was a lecture or even a weekend that my parents did at Camp Ramah, oh, probably in the 80s, with, what is his name? This lovely, lovely man who retired, changed careers in his 60s. I know exactly what he looks like. He was blonde. He was a lecturer at the American Jewish University. Before that, it was the University of Judaism. And he retired from his career as a professor and went to like social work school and got a degree in social work in his 60s. And one of his expertise was the whole weekend, I think, was dedicated to names, and kind of like the mostly of the Ashkenazic, but also the Sephardic world, of how Jews got their names and how they developed in different ways. And so the essential answer to your question is, Rita Claire, is it's really hard to know, because in some places we could say somebody whose name is Berdichev, right? I have a friend, there's a family Berdichev who we know in Israel. Well, their family came from this place called Berdichev. That's kind of clear. But doesn't mean that the person, when his name became Berdichev, lived in Berdichev. Because when he lived in another place in Vilna, they said, Berdichev, we'll call him. The same way you see in movies and TV and in literature where somebody says, hey, Texas, right? When they want to talk about somebody who they don't know, hey, new guy, who's the new guy? Hey, blonde woman, whatever, that kind of, not using a name, where somebody's from. For instance, the driver of my tank crew, I was with the same tank crew for over a decade in the regular Army service, and then we continued in reserves, was Ashkenazi. His name was Ashkenazi. Well, he was a Turk. They were Turkish Jews, but they were called Ashkenazi because when they lived in Turkey, they came originally, somebody in his family came from Ashkenaz, from Germany, from that area. So his name was Ashkenaz. I always thought that was funny that he was Sephardic, not even Mizrahi, he was Sephardic, he was from Turkey, but his name was Ashkenazi. And so it's really hard to know. And then names, of course, were changed in this country because of pronunciation problems or because they sounded too whatever. And they were changed in Israel as well. So, Ben Gurion, right? That was, I forgot what his original name was, but it was something else, right? A lot of the names were Hebraicized. Okay.
Yeah.
I will try to, maybe he's got a piece on that, Rita Claire. I'll try to remember his name. He's such a lovely, lovely man. Yeah. Okay. Any other comments or questions?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Okay. Has there been any archaeological data that's come out of what is now the West Bank?
Oh, yes, Roy, there's tons and tons. So just a really good example, Bethel or Beit El and Shiloh, those were areas where there were first archaeological digs. Much of it was dug already in the late 19th, early 20th century by European archaeologists who came. On both sides of both the West Bank and the East Bank, by the way, and then since the State of Israel in the pre-67 borders, there's a minister, there's the Office of Archaeology, whatever it's called, that's devoted to those kinds of things, and then their control spanned over the West Bank as well. There's a lot of it, and in many of those places, new settlements were built. So if I know you weren't with us last night, but for those who were last night, there was a woman who was interviewed by in the Christian Broadcasting Network piece, who was from Beit El, and that's a rather large settlement, Beit El. So yes, quite a lot. Was there a particular question, Roy, about a particular place?
No, there was nothing particular. It was strictly general because that had not been part of the subject matter today, and I was really curious, and I was really curious as to who who was partaking in this research and when the research was done and what significance it has in relationship to all of these things. Because as you know, I'm not able to attend every session.
Sure, of course.
And even though I would like to, and I'm just very curious about that because it ties in yesterday with today in my mind.
Right, and that's why archaeology became so popular amongst Israelis, and so
What are
many
you doing? Why are you
so many-
crying, huh?
so many armchair archaeologists as well are in Israel,
Yeah.
and the school children always went on a annual trip with their Bibles in hand and often to archaeological places. So let's just let's and in the background perhaps of what you just asked is um, is the claim that sometimes you hear that the Jews never really lived in that land, right? That there's a lot of mythology, or there, maybe there was no temple. There's a lot of polemics around archaeology and the political usage of archaeology, which is beyond the scope of what we can do today.
Yes.
But what I do want to do is to go to the last, the last verse here, and then the verse in Deuteronomy before I let you go in a few minutes. Do you have the text in front of you, Roy?
I do.
So would you go ahead and read the last section from for 13:15?
Certainly. Moses instructed the Israelites, saying, "This is the land you are to receive by lot as your hereditary portion, which the Lord has commanded to be given to the 9.5 tribes. For the Reubenite tribe, by its ancestral houses, the Gadite, did I say that right?
Yes, yes.
Tribe by its ancestral houses, and the half tribe of Manasseh have already received their portions. Those 2.5 tribes have received their portions across the Jordan, opposite Jericho, on the east, the orient side."
All right. So now we see explicitly, okay, the 2.5, you may have land over here, but that wasn't what's supposed to be the original plan. Right? That's a divergence from the original plan, which is a really interesting comment. Is this the same? Was this part of the list? I think that the list had its own lifespan. In fact, I know that the list had its own lifespan because this list is actually corresponds exactly with a list from ancient Egyptian writing. Let me just tell you, I forgot what century it's from. From the New Kingdom of Egypt, 15th century. Friends, this list, the way that it appears, is already the boundaries of the land of Canaan in the 15th century document in Egypt, right? In other words, the list has a literary life, and it was lifted from Egyptian literature or from other literatures, different back of the royal annals, and put into our Torah, and then given it the status of being commanded by God to Moses, to the people. To me, this is just really, really fascinating, and again, teaches me a great degree of humility when I want to claim something is authentic because we go back to our source. Sure, you can go back to the Bible. Let's even assume that Moses wrote the Bible. Let's even assume that it's from. But no matter what, by any degree, it's in the Egyptian annals. It's there. It's 15th century. So, really, really interesting stuff from my point of view. Let's take a look now. Gary, if you would read for us, if you guys can give me another 5 minutes, I think we can get the rest done. Deuteronomy 11. There are many lists we could look at, but instead of looking at a list, I decided to go for one slightly different approach in Deuteronomy.
Every spot on which your foot tread shall be yours, your territory shall extend from the wilderness to to Lebanon, and from the river, the Euphrates, to the western sea. No man shall stand up to you, the Lord, your God, will put the dread and fear of you over you, the whole land in which you set for, as promised you.
In other words, a slightly different approach. Much, much larger, Ella, apropos your comment question beforehand. But basically, folks, it's up to you. If you go out and walk on the land, symbolic, right? It's a metaphor for conquering the land, then you'll have it. And God backs you on that. This is quite a different approach, which to me just is why this is also fascinating. Now, one final thing to share with you. I put it in the chat box. Sorry, I need to. So you have it on your own. A map that just shows you just how academically complicated this is. This map is from Milgram. Well, he produced it from, reproduced it from someplace else, but it's from Milgram's commentary in the JPS, not Eitz Chaim, but the JPS separate volumes. See down here, real border, promised border, conjectured border, scouts route, and continuation of route in the borderland of Canaan. We're not going to go through all of them, but can you see? This is one of the reasons why I don't deal with maps so much. Yeah, of course it's important. Of course it's interesting. It's just really, really complicated. And here I just like the idea that the real border is that taken from a critical historical point of view, it never included this here. But not only did it not include this here, if you look up here, not north of Akko, this whole area here, those were separate kingdoms. The Israelites never got into that land beforehand. We think maybe it went this far. That's probably in the time of David. Historically, this was the farthest it went. But just really, really interesting. And this, of course, the includes the 2.5 clans, the 2.5 tribes that were here. Okay. Parting questions or comments, my friends?
Very good, very, very good class.
Thank you, Ella. All right, so we're going to have class every week at 11 going forward.
Oh, okay.
At least until June, or if it's, yeah, I assume that the class is going to run until June, the beginning of June, and that's it. Just remember, all rivers lead to the sea.
11 would be 9 o'clock in Israel, right?
Yeah, are you going to Israel now?
At the end of March for a month.
Okay. All right. So I will be in Israel if things go well. I will be there the 2nd and 3rd weeks of February. Not sure whether I'll be able to teach or not. I'm going to officiate at a wedding, and so a lot depends on that and when the wedding is. And okay. How is Bill doing today, Rita Claire?
Well, Bill, how are you doing?
I am breathing, and I had my medication this morning, and I'm okay.
Okay. And Klaus, how are you doing?
You have to unmute.
I did.
I'm doing well, thank you. I'm a little bit upset because I was supposed to see my surgeon today, and I got downgraded to a phone call. So I really don't like the telemetry.
Telemedicine.
Right, too much. But otherwise, I feel great. Thank you.
Well, it could have been worse. It could have been a telegraph.
Yeah.
Actually, it's a good sign when they don't want to see you so much.
Right.
And Roy, how is your husband doing?
Slightly better. So the graph is slowly going up, slowly. Thank you very much.
I have one comment about yesterday's and today's together, because many years ago, I saw a program on TV about people who were digging in Jerusalem, and they said they were down about the area of between the first and second temple, and they had found indications that the Jews there were actually worshiping idols, and that really
bothered you?
Bothered me until last night and today, because when we find, looking at what, yeah, I thought a few settlements in the West Bank is a problem, but I didn't realize how much of a problem it was, and that probably was the way it was forever, going all the way back to between the first and second temple. And those people that had found it, they were convinced that all the Jews were worshiping, idols.
Okay, so just a note about being careful from an academic point of view. The fact that idols were found in Ir David, to me, that doesn't mean that they're all worshiping idols. It means that they have things in their homes. If somebody came into our home and says,
Yeah.
"Ooh, can you see what I'm showing you?"
Yes, of course.
Shelf with all sorts of stuff. You've seen the shelf a number of times. Maybe you didn't notice there's quite a few, and some of them are put away, but there's quite a few Buddhas, and there's actually a few crosses. I have a collection of crosses as well. Somebody might get the impression that Sasha and I worship or were Buddhists or that we're Christians, and of course we're not, although we are respectful of those faith traditions. And oh yeah, I have this poster, and where was it now? It was hanging in my office.
It was at home in Jerusalem.
Oh yeah, so
but in home in Tel Aviv.
In Tel Aviv, right? So we when I was in Tel Aviv, I had an amazing graphic artist who was a member of mine, and she did posters for all of our lecture series. And one of the lecture series I did was called Jesus Comes to Ramat Aviv. And it was 4 lectures, one about Hebrew Bible, one about rabbinic literature, one about Jewish folk art, and one about, I don't remember what the 4th was about, maybe modern Hebrew literature, in which I had some of the best lectures from Hebrew University, Yari Zakovich, Avigdor Shenan, and we called it Yeshu Ba'al Ramat Aviv, which we thought was kind of smart-ass cute. And it had like, on top of our logo of Tiferet Shalom, it had like a crown of thorns. It was, and so that was in the background. Oh, that was on our wall in Jerusalem when we left Ramat Aviv, and we moved back to the house, or I moved back to the house in it was opposite the doorway of our house, our old apartment in Jerusalem we had until 2 years ago. So when you open up the door, that's what you would see, and it never dawned on me that anybody would take it very differently. But when at some point, was it? When did they tell us that we were Messianic Jews?
Yeah, I don't know, but it was the neighbors.
One of the neighbors upstairs, they said, that, "Oh no, you can't talk to them. They're Messianic Jews," which is kind of funny. I mean, to me, it's funny when these things, because it doesn't bother me. It's like when we're sitting around the table. I've said to folks before in the late '90s, and one of my friends, one of my colleagues from a conservative rabbi from LA who was rather homophobic said, David, you have to be careful what you're doing. People are going to start saying that you're gay. So I said, the girls were teenagers at the time, the older girls, I said, girls, tell your friends in the youth movement that your Abba's gay. And they burst out laughing and they said, but they've been saying that about you for years. So what I'm trying to say is that there's nothing embarrassing in any of these cases. I just get a kick out of it when people misinterpret it. But the same thing, now back to what you said, Sid, it could very well be people continue to have talismans or things in their houses from an aesthetic point of view, from a folkloristic point of view, it doesn't mean that they were they were enrolled in the local pagan temple.
Right.
Their membership dues. Yeah.
It just bothered me. It's just like,
okay.
And oh, there's one more thing. When I went into the yeshiva at MTJ, and there we had like 30 people in the dormitory, and they were all from all over the world. So rather than calling each other by their name, I was Scranton and somebody else was Toronto, and it was like, what that was our name.
So would you like us to call you Scranton from now on?
No.
Richard, could you make note of that in the QuickBooks?
Yes, I will. I'll put it in parentheses.
Scranton and Sue
Don't do
Spicer.
that.
Pardon me if I interrupted anybody.
Sure, of course, Roy. Go ahead.
But when one looks at representations, and usually artistic representations of the Buddha or Gautama Buddha, Buddhists do not worship that form. They merely see it as a representation of a teacher who was also striving for inner knowledge and enlightenment. It is not something to be worshipped.
Thank you. Thanks for that clarification. Excellent.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, everybody. Zayn Mir Gesund.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Be well. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Be
you.
well.
Bye-bye.